Hi, I'm Patricia Allingham Carlson, and this is my video, Birch Tree at the Top of the World. To create this painting, I used plastic wrap press into watercolor, white gouache, watercolor, and white acrylic pen and ink. I used wet on wet techniques and dry work too. And what I was trying to do was paint in the majesty and the mystery of a beautiful place called Mount Prospect, New York, that I had the privilege of being in. If you like it, please give it a thumbs up. And now let's paint. From Prospect Mountain on the top of a beautiful peak by Lake George, New York, I start out with a masking piece of paper blocking out my background. And then I begin to lay in some different colors all around it. I'm truly just playing with color here and letting the color do what it wants to do to see where I want to take it next. But I do have a plan to try to work with this beautiful photograph I have. The paper's wet. I'm putting down colors in a sort of random way. And then I'll see what happens next. A fun and low pressure way to start a painting. I will add this. I used concentrated colors so they'd be nice and bright when they dried. And now I'm using some pre-used plastic wrap, laying it on top of the whole big thing, covering it over and putting some weight on it. And the next day, here's what happened. I have textures and I have a sphere. I turn it 4 different ways and decide to work with the vertical orientation. And then I get out a piece of white pastel and begin to sketch. My composition will have the white birch tree and a river below and some sloping mountains. The white birch tree was right up there at the mountain peak with me. The sloping hills and water were far below. If I get my lines wrong, I can erase the white pastel easily. And I'm using some strips of paper to see where I like the horizon to be. The sphere will be a moon, and it will be a nighttime picture. And the moon will get to reflect into the water. I'm using watercolor now to sketch in where I previously sketched with the white pastel, which I will then erase. On my iPad there is the photograph that I had taken at the top of Prospect Mountain in New York. And I'm looking at it for a reference, although I am using it very loosely. Once my composition is to my satisfaction, I begin to paint in around the tree with a wash of darker tone that I'm hoping will homogenize the colors and allow the tree to stand out clearly. At the same time, I do not want to hide the colors because I really like the magical quality of them. I've taken some white gouache and I've diluted it with water. And I'm using that as a component of my whole basic landscape as well. And that's what you see in the small palette. As you know, gouache is an opaque form of watercolor. And it is also termed as Chinese white in your watercolor set. So most of you are familiar with that, I'm sure. Here I'm marking in the reflection of the moon on the water with white pastel. And then painting around that with a darker tone, primarily indigo watercolor. Bringing out the lines of my tree so I don't lose them with the white pastel. And then using the gouache to sketch in the tops of some of the hills and slopes in the background, as well as the clouds in the sky. And by the way, using the plastic wrap on top of wet watercolor creates some wonderful imprints. Random, very organic looking from the plastic wrap pressing its folds. It also pulls some color off and makes it all a lot more pale than if it had been left just as is and dried naturally. But I really do like the texturals that are imprinted by using this approach, so I use it a lot for experimental pieces and to try to make some unique paintings that are exciting to me visually, and hopefully to my audience as well. Here I'm painting darks around the lighter clouds in the sky. And marking where I want the drama of the sky and the movement, compositionally speaking. And you'll notice there's a lot of diagonal lines going on. Diagonals tend to add movement and a dynamic kind of flow. After all the diagonals in the sky, I'm coming in with my horizontal slopes and hillsides that go across. Horizontals tend to add peacefulness to a landscape or to any kind of painting. And verticals tend to add some energy. With each slope I paint, I'm working to make it lighter at the top where the moon would presumably light it up, and darker toward the bottom as it goes into shadow. That way each layer of land stands out against the one above it. Spraying around the moon, blocking it off, adding more layers of dark. The reason I re-wet the paper was because I wanted the darks to spread and be soft and not hard-edged. And painting around the orb to enhance the roundness of that form with some darks to make it stand out, as well as some lights for the sky. This painting for me is about the drama and the magic of the mood. And actually standing in this place, given in the daytime, I literally did feel on top of the world. It was exhilarating to be up there. When I use the white gouache, I frequently use my fingers. I'll put some down, I will give it a blend, I will add some more, and I will blend that some. And using my fingers works for me, although it might not work for many artists. But if you do use your fingers while you're working with watercolor, make sure you don't put them in your mouth by accident, because that's really not a good idea, as many watercolors have toxic materials in them. And wash your hands carefully and frequently if you're doing that. Again, for those reasons, many people would not use their fingers at all. And that goes for professional watercolors. whereas a schoolcraft quality would not have anything toxic in it. Marking in the path of the moon with my gouache. Which, by the way, this particular gouache does not have any toxics. Can you see how adding the dark next to the white of the moon reflection makes it start to pop out? One of the exciting things about being a painter to me. And I'm keeping the front slopes for a separate kind of approach, as they will be considered closer in the composition to my eye as a viewer than the further away slopes. Another layer of darks coming in and around the tree. And at this point you can see the composition beginning to take place and form. Also at this point you're going to see a lot of minutiae, very small tweaks, adjustments, blends, softenings. And that is pretty much how much of the rest of the painting continued from this point. Layer upon layer, dark upon dark, and increasing light upon increasing light. All the while trying to preserve much of the texture that I imprinted in the first place with the plastic wrap. At this point I have sprayed down with water quite heavily my front slopes, and I'm laying in quite heavily some concentrated watercolor pigment. I put a piece of masking paper over the birch tree where it came in front of that layer. So no paint would bleed into that area. And now I'm splattering white ink diluted with water. This is white acrylic ink onto that wet watercolor paint. And taking some plastic wrap and laying that on top along with a weighted book to try to create some more texture. And I let that sit overnight with some weight on it. The next day I pull off those weights leave the area and decide to develop the moon, which is a big white empty sphere. I've dabbed it with some craters, sprayed it with some water, and then I'm going back in to try to create some suggested crater detail. I am looking at a reference photo of the actual real moon to try to get some ideas on how to approach that. And now I'm using my white gouache to do some enhancing of light up in the clouds around the moon. Wanting the edges to be soft but lit. I put down the gouache and then I blend them. In this case, I'm using my brush instead of my fingers. And now I'm using some of the white gouache on the actual orb to even out the edges around the outside. Some more illumination on the clouds. Another layer of white gouache on the moon. And lots of tweaking. I wonder how many of you, excuse me, listen to music while you're painting, because I sure have mine, and I'm sure enjoying my music as I paint this painting. It feels like playing music and painting go together so well, and each take you into the zone that you're hoping to get to in doing an imagination piece like this. Now the front textures on these front slopes did not come out as strongly as I was hoping. So I'm going back to start to enhance them, bringing out treetops with some lights and the shadows down below, and attempting to show some depth in these slopes by doing so. Now I've gotten out my bottle of white acrylic ink and an ink pen, and I'm outlining some white birch branches that are going on top of the distant slopes. I found this white acrylic ink can cover quite beautifully, but it also does tend to absorb some of the watercolor from beneath it and end up turning colors and not being quite as bright as I would like. So I found that I have to add layers. So this will be the first layer you'll see me adding. This is my marking layer for where I want these branches to be. And the tree itself will be getting more detailing. I hesitate to leave the lid off of my white ink for two reasons. One being I don't want it to evaporate during the time I'm working from it. And the second being that several times I've knocked the tall container right over and made a dreadful mess all over my desk. So I try to keep it lidded. Back to my gouache, I am now enhancing the illuminated side of the white birch tree with my gouache, as well as making the other side stand out from the night sky. So this will be adding a second layer of lightness on top of where the watercolor mixed with the whites and turned pretty colors instead of staying as white as I would like. I have the basic shape of the tree all formed out with the light color, and now I'm coming in with some shadows. The shadows are being placed under the branches that are lit up on top, as well as on the far side of the tree, which will be far more shadowed, of course, than the left-facing side. This helps the tree to stand out a little more cleanly against the background, since it's more in the foreground. And coming back in with my second or third, in some cases, layer of white acrylic ink to enhance my lights. And now I'm using the ink pen to enhance the tops of the front slopes of the trees. I put down a lacy pattern for the treetops, and then I soften it with my finger. In many cases, this will be the third or fourth layer of white acrylic onto the branches where I want them to really stand out. I am building up these layers with a lot of patience. And now I'm taking a real branch from a tree or a twig, and I'm trying to see where it might look right, because the tree felt like it needed another branch. I found a spot where I thought it looked good, and now I'm proceeding to add that with my white ink. And working into the interior bark of the tree, I begin to put in the characteristic, very white markings of the white birch tree. as well as the darks and the details. And the tree begins to form even more nicely now, working with the interior bark. And the darks on the far side. I bet you can tell I'm having fun with this one, because I certainly did. The place and even the memory of the place was so exciting. I really enjoyed painting it. Adding touches here and there, flashes of brights, building up another layer, and that's exactly how the rest of the painting proceeded again. Let's skip ahead here now I'm moving toward the very top of the tree. It's sort of a judgment call for me as to how much detail I want to put at the top, or how soft I want to leave the expression of the tree reaching up into the sky. With the softness that I'm working with, I'm almost trying to suggest infinity and the heavens and reaching up, softening, blending. A merging of tree and sky. Maybe a feeling of the vast spirit. Coming back into the moonlight, I am reflecting it into the water with another layer of stronger white. And enhancing the edges of the moon with some white. The moonlight on the water becomes a sort of dance of gold and white. And the darkness around the edges makes it all pop out. Some more dark shadows to define these front tree forms. Particularly down toward the bottom of the paper where less moonlight would reach. And then the darks around the treetops help them to stand out from the water. This is my evaluation technique where I cover up one side and then the other. See what my eye calls out needs to be done or added or detailed. or take it out. And that's exactly what you see me doing here. I am adding. And in adding the darks around the tree becomes something that will stand out a little bit more in some spots. Primary dark I've been adding in this has been indigo. And I do another evaluation. And make more adjustments. A little more gold around the moon, where it needed a bit of color. And that color, by the way, was yellow ochre, which I then also bring into the foreground a bit on the left. Another evaluation technique is that I do turn the paper over entirely, and that will often show me some other things that could be helpful to adjust. I turn the paper sideways, and I also walk across the room from it. All different ways to make my eyes see the paper a little bit more differently and perhaps more objectively. Getting close. I sign it and it's done. Get out a little mat and give it a try around the edges. Again, we're done. I hope you enjoyed my video, Birch Tree at the Top of the World. Give it a thumbs up and subscribe. And ring the bell below. You'll get notifications for future videos too, so you don't miss any. There's also below links to products I use, and my Facebook art page, my blog, and my products website store. I'll see you next video.